Good morning, everyone. As agreed at the Assembly's annual meeting on the 14th of May 2021, the Confirmations Hearing Committee is allowed to appoint a chair on a meeting-by-meeting basis for the 21-22 Assembly year. For the first item of business, I will conduct an election for the chair for this meeting in accordance with the GLA's standing orders. In the event of one candidate being nominated, I will declare the nominated candidate chair of the Confirmation Hearings Committee for this meeting. A proposer and seconder is required for each nomination. In the event of two candidates being nominated, I will ask for votes in favour of each candidate. Are there any nominations?
I propose Assemblymember Hall.
And does anyone wish to second that?
I'd second that.
And are there any other nominations? Then I declare that Assemblymember Hall is elected chairman of the Confirmations Hearing Committee for today's meeting.
Thank you. Right, good morning. Can I welcome everyone to this meeting of the Confirmation Hearings Committee. Our main item of business today is to hold a confirmation hearing for the Office of Deputy Chair of Transport for London. But first we have a few short items of formal business to go through. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this morning. Can I ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received for today's meeting?
Chairman, no apologies have been received.
Thank you, Lauren. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 3 and ask Assembly members if they have any other disclosable pecuniary interests to declare? No. Can I also invite Heidi Alexander to declare any interest relevant to the business of the meeting or in relation to the proposed appointment?
None.
No, thank you. Can we note the membership on the term of reference for the Confirmation Hearings Committee as agreed at the annual meeting on the 14th of May 2021? Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting of the committee held on the 15th of October 2019 indeed, to be signed by me as a correct record? Yep, thank you. Can I welcome you, Heidi Alexander, to the meeting? The committee will be putting questions to you in relation to your proposed appointment to the Office of Deputy Chair of Transport for London. However, can I first ask members to note the background information circulated within the agenda for the meeting and note the supplementary information which was received after publication of the agenda, and that is Heidi Alexander's CV and supporting statement, and a summary of key issues and priorities for Transport for London. Thank you. Now we'll move on to the questions and answer session. And I'll start with the questions. Heidi, what do you think you have personally brought to the role of Deputy Chair of Transport for London over the past 3 years?
Thank you, Chair. It's good to be here this morning, and can I congratulate you all on your re-election or your election for the first time in the case of Assembly members Fortune and Moema, who I both have the pleasure to have known at previous points in my political life, shall we say. So I think your question is, what do I bring to the role? I think I bring my personal attributes, which is a hard work ethic, the ability to think strategically, some diplomatic skills that I've honed after 15, 16 years in local politics and London politics. I obviously have a significant political experience, having been a local authority councillor, an executive member in the London Borough of Lewisham, and I was the Member of Parliament for 8 years representing Lewisham East. I think those experiences are really beneficial in this role because I'm obviously not a household name, but I am stopped on the street in Lewisham. People aren't shy to tell me what they think about the provision of public transport services in London. I think that helps to keep me grounded. I think it helps to keep TfL and City Hall grounded. And I also think that I bring a really granular understanding of London politics. I think not quite, but pretty much every local authority leader in London would have my mobile phone number. Lots of members of Parliament do too, and so I stay connected to the concerns of their constituents. I've obviously had 3 years working with the Assembly as well, and I know how important it is to be responsive to you so that you can serve your constituents effectively. I've devoted quite a chunk of my life over the last 3 years to the role that I've been doing, and you know, at the height of the pandemic I was probably working 18-hour days, and so when I talk about a hard work ethic, I think I've proven that over the last 3 years.
Okay, can I ask if the volume can be turned up, if anybody, are colleagues able to hear okay?
Just about.
It would be helpful if it was turned up.
Would be helpful to be slightly louder.
Yes.
Can,
I will attempt to throw my voice more, Chair. Is that helpful?
That's lovely. I'm sure if somebody can turn it up a bit, because also I don't want you straining to hear the questions, and it's lower than we're used to. Thank you for the answer for that. You say people stop you in the street. What do they actually say to you when they stop you in the street?
Well, one of the most recent occasions was to talk to me about whether TfL were actually going to be able to take control of South Eastern services. You will be aware that there's a big debate about rail devolution, and so that's probably one of the most recent conversations that I've had on the train coming in from Lewisham. I was also stopped in the park last week when I went for my daily walk, and it was actually really nice to have someone say, I bet people don't say this to you very often, but thank you for everything that you do for TfL. And when we were in the height of the negotiations with government around the funding deal, that was the pick-me-up that I needed. People talk to me about the accessibility of the bus service. People want, I think, to see more routes in outer London. I think people who have disabilities often talk to me about their experience on the bus network, and so those are just a few examples of some of the things that I've had conversations about recently.
Okay, well certainly with the people with disabilities, I'm sure we'd all be very grateful if you could do more to help them, because they're the ones that find it the most difficult to get around, whether it's on train or on bus, or even using black cabs in order to get the wheelchair in. And I'm sure everybody will agree they're the people that need to be cared for beyond everybody else. I'm going to go to the next question now, Peter.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's lovely to see you again, Heidi. Heidi has battered me in 2 elections so far, and I'm interested when you got this job, because if I got beaten a 3rd time, it would have started to look like I enjoyed it. But in this role over the last few years, what do you think have been your biggest challenges, and what have you done to overcome that?
Thanks, Peter. And can I just say, in those elections that we contested, Peter was always thoroughly decent and annoyingly capable. And so I say I'm pleased to see you on the Assembly, but it is with some sense of trepidation as well. So in terms of the biggest challenges I think you asked me about so far, I mean, clearly the last year for Transport for London has been unlike any other in its history. Dealing with COVID has been really very, very difficult. And if I think back to March of last year, there were often days when I woke up and I did wonder whether the tubes would be running. We had huge levels of absence. It was very volatile. You know, people don't all get sick at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and tell their manager that they're not going to be in the next day. And so I think it was a minor miracle that we were able to keep services going, to be honest. We had to get people off the tube and the bus network. We had to maintain relations with our staff and our trade unions. People were actually really scared, and so I think that was a huge challenge last year. Pre-COVID, I would say I had 2 major challenges. One is about Tfl funding, and of course, I do need to say this, the previous mayor, who is now Prime Minister, did negotiate away TfL's direct operating subsidy which was worth £700 million a year to TfL. And that meant that when COVID hit, TfL as an organisation was left needlessly exposed to the fluctuation, the huge fluctuation that we saw in fare income. Now, I think that actually we had a good record pre the pandemic in bringing financial discipline to TfL. We increased cash balances by 13%, reduced the operating deficit on a like-for-like basis by 71%. We decreased our use of agency staff very significantly, which saved somewhere in the region of £4 million a week. There were huge problems that were created financially as a result of COVID, but given the deal done today, we have actually secured nearly £5 billion in funding from government, and so it is the funding model is problematic, but I am grateful for the money that government has supported London with. The other challenge, I think it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention this, has been around Crossrail. When I started this job in June 2018, so almost exactly 3 years ago, I inherited a project that was in a state of disarray. The previous management team, the previous chair, in my view, were out of their depth. We had to get a new management team in. I've done a lot of work to improve transparency on the project. Again, negotiated with government to secure around £3 billion worth of financing to enable the project to continue. We transitioned the governance into TfL now as well. And so I think we're making progress, but Crossrail has obviously been a challenge.
Thank you. I think there's a couple of issues there that I know other colleagues are going to ask you about, but I just wanted to sort of echo your comments about how pleased we are that we've got another government bailout. That's really great for the people of London. Going back to the issue around COVID, when you talked about relations and you talked about maintaining those relationships with staff, trade unions, government as well, can you tell us a little bit more about what you did to help with those relationships?
Yeah, so I'll take each of them in turn. With respect to trade unions, I would have quite regular calls, perhaps once every sort of 6 weeks or so, to check in both with the general secretaries and with the local reps in terms of, and sometimes outside the scope of those meetings, there would be times when we'd have to have one-on-one conversations, understandably, during April, following the absolutely tragic death of a high number of bus drivers. Unite were understandably very concerned to ensure that we were doing everything that we could to make sure that the bus network was safe for staff and customers, and so I did do a lot of work with Unite and with the then Director of Bus Operations, Claire Mann, at TfL, to do absolutely everything we could as soon as we could in line with Public Health England recommendations. And so that was the nature of that engagement. With respect to government, I was involved in all of the meetings from a City Hall perspective around funding negotiations following the May funding settlement. I don't call it a bailout because I think it's wrong to call it a bailout. I think it's actually compensating TfL for lost fare income caused by the pandemic, but that's a side point. I think following that first May settlement, the London Transport Oversight Group was established. That included representatives both at ministerial and official level from DFT, representatives from Number 10, from Network Rail, the senior management of TfL, the British Transport Police. We met on a weekly basis to start off with, and then on a fortnightly basis for the period of that funding settlement. We had discussions about issues such as face masks and whether we should make face masks mandatory on public transport. I was a very strong advocate of that very early on, and actually remember meetings where I said, actually I don't want it on my conscience that there would be a second wave in London because we haven't made it mandatory to wear a face mask on public transport, and I'm pleased that we were able to get to a position with government that meant that we applied the same rules at the same time, because I think it would have been confusing for Londoners if TfL had had a different set of rules to the train operating companies. So I hope that gives you some sense of, from a trade union and government perspective, how that worked. I don't know, I can't remember whether there was a third group that you were asking me about, so forgive me. Staff. Yeah, so of course I had daily phone calls and virtual team calls with the then Commissioner and his senior management team, and they, in turn had a whole series of, virtually daily briefings with their own staff, and so, yeah, that was quite an intense relationship. I think I was very fortunate that I'd been able to build up a trusting and professional and mature relationship with the TfL senior management, because they were testing times for everyone, and I'm pleased that we were able to do what we did to actually get people off of using public transport. And it seems like a really strange thing to say for an organisation that is set up to get people using public transport, but I am very proud of the fact that before the government actually moved to a lockdown, TfL had already started its public messaging campaign about not using the public transport network unless it was for critical journeys. And I do think that the fact that we did that in the week before the lockdown was announced, I do believe it will have saved lives, because as we all know, days make a real difference.
Okay, thank you. We've got quite a few questions to go through, so if I can ask you to try and keep the answers slightly shorter, we'd all be grateful. Thank you. Going over now to Assembly Member Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Haida. I know that you've been the Deputy Mayor for Transport for the last 3 years, so this is regarding to the Mayor's transport strategy, the three core themes being healthy streets and healthy people, good public transport experience, and new homes and jobs. What have been your successes in regard to those three core themes of the Mayor's transport strategy?
Okay, so if I take healthy streets for healthy people to start off with, I think the introduction of the ultra-low emission zone in central London in April 2019 is probably one of the biggest successes, and I'm very proud to have worked with the Deputy Mayor for Environment, Shirley Rodriguez, on that. The reduction in roadside nitrogen dioxide that has been brought about as a result of that scheme is quite astonishing, and I think it's totally the right thing that is extended out to the North and South Circular in October. On public transport, I think one of the things that I am most proud about is the arrival of the new 710 trains on the London Overground. Some of you will remember that there were lots of delays in getting these new trains, especially onto the Gospel Oak to Barking line. I had to do a lot of work with Bombardier, the train manufacturer, and it was fantastic to actually see those new trains running. And I think some of the improvements that we've seen in central London tube stations, places like Victoria, the refurbishment works there, are actually really improving the experience for people using public transport. On homes and new jobs, I would say that it has been good to get the TfL housing programme off the ground. I think if we were all honest, we would have liked to have seen more progress on that, but the fact that people are moving into homes now, we're on site in places like Kidbrooke, I think it's totally right to be building homes next to public transport stations, interchanges, and that's what the TfL programme, housing programme is about. And I was also pleased that we secured money, £370 million, from two housing infrastructure bids, one for the East London line and one for the DLR, and I think they could bring about transformation in some of the areas on those lines as well.
And what have been the challenges?
Well, how long have you got? I'm mindful of the chair's advice about keeping my remarks brief. I assume you mean with respect to the mayor's delivering the mayor's transport strategy. I think COVID again has affected the progress that we had been making towards the sustainable mode share target. We want 80% of journeys in London to be done by people walking, cycling, using public transport. Clearly, in the last year, people have been using their cars more than they've been using public transport, although we have seen more people walking and cycling. And I think one of the things that I need to be very mindful of is how we don't have a car-led recovery, because we can't choke off London's recovery, and I think there could be a danger of that. I think in terms of public transport and those challenges over the last 3 years, again, the funding issue has come into play. We had to stop the purchase of new Northern and Jubilee line trains. We had to suspend the Piccadilly line signalling programme. We also had to pause the Canary Wharf to Rotherhithe Bridge, and so those things have been challenging. I also think, on going back to healthy streets, I think the relationship with some of the boroughs has been challenging. I was very disappointed not to be able to deliver the new cycleway through Notting Hill Gate because of the actions of Kensington and Chelsea Council, and really disappointed not to be able to deliver the works at Swiss Cottage as well. And so, because boroughs own 95% of the roads in London, I think that that's a challenge.
Great. Thank you.
Assemblymember Cooper. Thank you, Chair. I mean, obviously, there's been a huge number of challenges. You came in, I think, at a very difficult time in terms of Crossrail progress, just to give one minor example, or not so minor. Do you think, 2018 up until now, that there's anything more that you could have done to improve the transport network in London for Londoners?
I'd have liked to have seen faster delivery of Crossrail, and I regret not pushing the new team harder to take their time to determine how long it was going to take. If I look back on that period, because they went in, the more that they discovered about the project, the longer the actual delivery date was pushed out, and I think we should have taken more time at the beginning to understand exactly the state with the new leadership team that the project was in. I do think, though, that in terms of public transport delivery, I know it's hard to think about pre-COVID, but we have got lots of things that we're really proud of, and that I'm very proud to have been part of delivering. So, the fares freeze for 5 years, which arrested that huge increase that we saw under the previous mayor. We've delivered those, new trains, new infrastructure that I've already talked about. We were able to increase the peak hour frequencies on a number of lines, such as the Victoria and Jubilee, when we used to have that tidal wave of people going to the tube, which we don't see anymore, but we hope will return one day soon. So I think there's been lots of positives. I would have liked to have seen more rapid progress with Crossrail.
Now, obviously, a key part of your role as the Deputy Chair of Transport for London is to support the Chair in leading the TfL board. How satisfied are you with your performance in that role? Is there anything that you would change? You just pulled out in your previous answer some of the positives that have been achieved, which I think is very good, although we obviously know some of the blockages that have happened. But how satisfied are you in your performance as the Deputy Chair of the TfL board? Is there anything that you could improve on there?
I think I devote a lot of time to my Deputy Chair role, as distinct from the Deputy Mayoral role. I sit on a number of the committees in TfL's governance structure. So I chair the Elizabeth Line Committee. Since we collapsed the Crossrail Board, I've taken on responsibility for chairing that Elizabeth Line Committee, and I also sit on the Remuneration, Finance and Programme and Investment Committee. I think that I've got good relationships with the board members. We did a very successful commissioner recruitment as well, which involved board members. Obviously secured the services of Andy Byford, who's a world-class transport leader. And so I think I'm satisfied with the work that I've done in terms of that governance side of things. And we've had a board effectiveness review done as well. And they have actually highlighted, it's a public document, that they've actually seen very significant improvements in the way that the board operates compared to the way that it did prior to 2016.
Now, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has upended how people move and how people work in London. I'm not so sure that I ever do want to go back to the kind of crush that we saw in the rush hour on the tube, and I speak as someone who's literally just got out of the Northern Line this morning and found it a much more pleasant experience. I'm rather hoping that the rush hour period will be spread over far more hours than the ridiculously short rush hour, and also that if people are balancing working from home with working at office, that we do see much more of a mix and match, and perhaps we won't go back to the old days when I could spend 20 minutes with my face in somebody's armpit, or potentially even worse than that. Now, that is a fundamental change, and two things really that I'd like you to comment on. One is, I know that you've been involved in this COVID pandemic board that has been set up, which I think you co-chair, and I just wondered if we could unpack a bit about how well you think that's been working. I know that Andrew Gilligan has been involved in it, and I know that he's very fond of, he has particular views about cycling, for example. Perhaps you could talk us through a bit about what that has been doing. How do you think that going forward that COVID is going to change the role of the Deputy Chair of Transport for London and the Deputy Mayoral role? How do you see that changing the overall picture?
Okay.
I mean, it may go back to how it was, but
Yeah.
I personally don't think it ever will.
Yeah, it's a fair point, and in all of this, I do think we often talk about building back better, and I think there's a real opportunity here around building back better, and it is slightly crazy when you think back to the fact that millions of Londoners all got up at the same time in the morning, all piled onto the buses and the tubes all at the same time. Transport for London had to organise itself to be able to meet that huge peak in capacity, and actually perhaps there is a different way of organising ourselves, and I think that that probably is about TfL. I've thought about this, and I think it's people often think about Transport for London as being a provider of services. They run the tube, or a commissioner of services. They let bus contracts to bus companies. Some people might say, well, they're a regulator as well, because they regulate taxi and private hire. I think more recently they've become a custodian of London's environment with things such as ULEZ. They've become a developer in terms of building housing. But I did say recently, when I was doing a presentation to some business representatives from the city, that I actually think TfL's future is about being a facilitator of mobility. What sort of mobility do we need as a city in order to be economically successful and socially cohesive going forward? And I think that we've got a lot of competitors out in the market at the moment. Some people will take a choice between do I take the bus or do I get an Uber? We know that we've seen the proliferation of things like dockless e-bikes. We've got the e-scooter trial starting, and so I think Transport for London really needs to keep its eyes on the horizon and make sure that it it is at the centre of ensuring that we have a proper integrated network for how people want to move around. So I think it's a really interesting area actually about how COVID might open up opportunities going forward as well.
That's interesting, and obviously it was only a few years ago when Transport for London first went into providing cycles that people could rent, and previously that wasn't part of the service that was provided. Can I just ask you, this was my follow-up if you don't mind, Chair. I was really struck when Grant Shapps, the Secretary of State for Transport, was talking about moving towards the Great British Railway, that he quoted Transport for London as an example of a successful system several times. Do you agree with him? Do you take that as a compliment? And why do you think he was particularly referencing Transport for London? What is Transport for London doing so well that he threw that into the national conversation in that way?
I think he is right about that, and I think we should take that as a vote of confidence in our Transport Authority. I think he was particularly referencing the improvements that we have brought about on London Overground and the contractual model that TfL has with the train operating companies, which is what the Secretary of State is now seeking to replicate on the national railways. One point I would make, however, is that the success of London Overground is partly about the way in which the train operating company is incentivised to perform. They will be docked money if they skip stations or if there's poor reliability, and there are contractual incentives in place to ensure that you're getting the very best possible service from the TOC. I think though, so it's partly about the contractual model, but it is about investment, and you have to invest in the rolling stock and the infrastructure and customer service. And if you want a world-class railway, you're not going to be able to do it on the cheap. And so I think he's right to talk about the model, but I think it's there is a sort of bigger and broader issue there as well. And I have heard him talk very positively about the way that, you know, London's buses operate and our integrated ticketing system, the fact that you can pay with your phone, you can pay with a contactless card, that you have the daily caps, the weekly caps. I think that people in the rest of the country look at London and say, well, if they've got that, why can't we have it? And they're right. We should be able as a country to find a way to provide that sort of quality public transport service to everyone.
That's a very interesting point about ticketing. I think all that comes back to the first mayor, who sometimes has his name traduced in many parishes across London, but I think at that point deciding to introduce that the Oyster card system was a very interesting development. Let's hope the rest of the country goes that way. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Just going back to the Mayor's transport strategy, to what extent have you delivered on the priorities set out in that strategy, and what went particularly well, and where was there a sticking point?
Yeah. So I think on the Healthy Streets for Healthy People agenda, we have delivered the ultra low emission zone, which is starting to tackle toxic air in London. We have tripled protected cycling space in the previous term, and we've got about 100 kilometres of extra space for cyclists, safe space, that has either been constructed or is being constructed or upgraded since March of last year. So we've seen a real rapid expansion of the cycling network, which I think is really good. We've completed work at 41 safer junctions. We have launched the direct vision standard to improve the safety of lorries that are on London streets. So I think that from that perspective, in the Healthy Streets agenda, those are the positives. I think I've already referred to some of the challenges actually, so I won't repeat them, but I do feel that, and perhaps some people might think this is quite inflammatory what I'm about to say, but I do feel that there are some local authorities in central London, namely Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster, who hold the rest of the city to ransom when it comes to safe cycling infrastructure. And so, you know, I would have liked to have been able to deliver routes through those two boroughs, but have been frustrated. On public transport, I don't want to repeat myself, but I think, you know, we have upgraded the rolling stock on the overground, the improvements to the stations. We are, you know, it's clearly work in progress still on Crossrail, Northern Line extension, extension of the London Overground out to Barking Riverside. But we, you know, we're getting there with all of those projects. And I think on the new homes and giving people access to good jobs part of the MTS, we've got the housing programme off the ground. There's a huge number of planning permissions that have been granted. I think it's 7,000 that we've now got granted, ready to be built when we can put a commercial sort of funding mechanism in place to do that. We've got about another 4,500 in the pipeline. I would have liked to have seen you know, more homes having been completed and people moving in over the last few years. But to go from a standing start, I think that is actually quite an achievement still.
And thinking about the good public transport experience, and I know that, you know, COVID has changed everything over this last year, but before then, do you think that people were getting a good public transport experience? Was it getting better?
I think broadly, yes. I mean, there were occasions on which we have experienced problems. We are upgrading the signalling on the 4 subsurface lines at the moment. It's a project called 4LM, 4 lines modernisation, that affects the Metropolitan, Hammersmith and City, Circle and District. And we basically update the signalling in sections. And when we did the second section, this was pre-COVID, we did have a lot of technical difficulties which resulted in considerable delays. I think it was on the Metropolitan line. And so I've spent quite a lot of time working with the team at TfL to make sure that we are being pragmatic and sensible in how we roll out the next phases, because it's quite hard to convince people of the benefits of a signalling upgrade if they've actually experienced quite a lot of disruption when it's going in. So, yeah, apologies, I may not be answering your question exactly. I think you were asking me, is the experience of people on the public transport network getting better? And I think that, you know, on the tube we were running, you know, generally speaking, reliable, high quality, affordable public transport services. On the rare occasions when I've actually spoken in the last 3 years at events abroad, I think actually I've only done it once, but it was really noticeable to me that people from actually all over the world would come and talk to me about the quality of London's public transport offer and how integrated it was. And I think some of the time we can beat ourselves up about things, but actually it is a really high quality service that TfL provides.
Okay. So very quickly, because I'm mindful of the Chair's advice as well, there are a lot of challenges coming down the line, excuse the pun, because of the MTS anyway. Then we've hit COVID, which has thrown up some more challenges. Perhaps there are elements of that MTS that need to be thought about again, or you know, or refocused. So if you were to pick the top 3 challenges you had coming up over the next couple of years, what would they be?
Funding, avoiding a car-led recovery, and I think this issue that I was talking about in response to Assembly Member Cooper's question, the fact that we are operating in a very competitive mobility marketplace, that there are other providers that want to capture our market share. And so I think those are the top 3 issues.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, Heidi. So I've got quite a soft question and then a harder question. The first question is thinking a little bit further ahead, because we've discussed a lot of very sort of day-to-day challenges here, and I think a lot of the next 3 years is going to be taken up with day-to-day management challenges. But I think, you know, we are aiming higher than that as a London Transport Authority. So I want to ask you what you think the biggest opportunity is for you to achieve as the Deputy Chair of Transport for London over the coming term, and what's the vision and mission that you, from the Mayor's office, have to inspire Londoners to come with you towards that goal?
Okay, good question. So I think the biggest opportunity is actually making a reality of building back better. And we know that people tend to change their behaviour when they go through a big change in their life. So if people move house or they get a new job, they might start travelling to work in a different way pre-COVID, and there's some behavioural research that demonstrates that that's the case. And I think that this is a moment of reset, potentially, as we emerge out of the pandemic. And I just think back to those really dark and gloomy days of the first lockdown, albeit we did have some sunshine as well, which was nice, and the images of thousands of people cycling in Parliament Square, children on segregated cycle routes, whether it was on Cycleway 4 or the embankment. And I actually think there's a real opportunity to deliver a cleaner, greener, fairer London, underpinned by more sustainable travel choices. And I think it also goes back to this point that Assemblymember Cooper was making about perhaps living our lives slightly differently, having a better work-life balance, being more flexible in where we work and how we work, and us making sure that the transport system enables that.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, we'll really look forward to seeing you and the Mayor really, pushing that vision of what's possible. Because I'm going to go on to my next question now, which is about wrinkles and problems that have occurred, and what you might have learned from those and what you might do differently. And I think it's important to ask, if you're asking to be reconfirmed, what you've learned so far and what you might have done differently before. And I've got two sort of examples to throw at you that might be ways in which you might have thought differently about things. One is the rather large number of legal issues that you've had. There's been quite a few things that you've tried to push forwards that have come into legal difficulties, even how you've dealt with the challenge of Uber, for example. That's ended up right at the top of in high profile court cases, and there's a number of other examples, and I don't know if there's more that you might do in your next term to manage those risks. And then on the wider issue of risk and resilience, you said earlier that the withdrawal of grant left you needlessly exposed to the risk of coronavirus. So given that you knew that, and it's not like you and the Mayor weren't vocal about that risk, the fact that we were relying almost entirely on fares income and that was a risk, would you have done more to mitigate that risk, looking for other sources of income from other fairer ways of charging people for driving on the roads, for example, or other sources of income altogether, if you'd have really seen that risk about to materialise?
Yeah. Okay. So, of course, the Uber case that you quote, Uber appealed against our licensing decision, and that is out of our control. And there's a process around licensing where it goes, to the magistrates' court. I accept to an extent your point about some of the other schemes. In terms of making, decisions, for example, about the Swiss cottage, the removal of the Swiss cottage gyratory, and how we went about that scheme in particular. I think there were lessons to be learned there from the planning of the cycle route. But again, these things are slightly out of our control. It was Westminster Council that brought the case. I think we've learned specifically about even if you are considering issues at the time around implementation of different schemes, it's very important to also document fully and have a clear audit trail about things, all the items that you're discussing, because often on some of these legal cases where we've fallen down is around process. And so I think that is a piece of learning for the organisation. In terms of would we have done more to establish other sources of income? I mean, some of the decisions that we have taken income. So if you think, for example, you know, we would take decisions about what is right for the city in terms of environmental outcomes. So when we removed the exemption for mini cabs from the congestion charge, I think that was the right thing to do, given the, you know, the huge increase in the number of mini cabs that we saw in central London. But there is a consequential benefit, not the reason for doing it, but a consequential benefit of additional income to TfL as well. And so I think that I think where it's been the right thing to do for the city, we haven't been shy about taking those decisions.
Okay, some of the Mayor's comments today do suggest that the goal is to go back to reliance on fair income. I mean, that is something you would do differently though, isn't it? You more proactively want to, in the future, create new sources of income that are fairer.
Yeah, I mean, we have sought to have a discussion with government about genuine fiscal devolution, and we've talked a lot in this chamber about devolving vehicle excise duty, for example, to create a new source of income for London's transport system. I mean, I would be up for talking to government about whether they are exploring, say, online sales tax, where you could, tax online purchases, non-vatable purchases, and create a new income stream for TfL. People are doing more online shopping, and we see more vans on our streets. Would that be a way of creating a new income stream for TfL? And so, I'm up for creative discussions with government. That would require legislation to do something like that.
That's not something within your current powers. I'm more thinking about things within your current powers, but
yeah. So that's one example that I would give. You will know that we've said in the Mayor's Transport Strategy that we will keep the road user charging schemes under review. In order to achieve our environmental and economic objectives for the city as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I better stop there. But it doesn't sound like we're going to see any more progress in the next 3 years in terms of resilience, in terms of our finances, than we've seen in the last few, from what you've just said.
Well, I want to work with government on this, and I believe that the Mayor has spoken directly to the Secretary of State about this very issue. So we've got to find a way to get greater fiscal devolution so that TfL has the funding that it needs.
Share your concerns, Assembly Member. Assembly Member Momar, sorry, is that correct?
Moima, yes.
Moima, forgive me, thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. So I have a question for you, which is around building and maintaining an effective transport, which you know better than I do, that involves convening partner organisations and stakeholders from across London, and they very often will have diverging agendas. And if you could just tell us a bit about how successful you've been in influencing these partners and to work with you to deliver an effective transport network.
Good question. I think probably the COVID example is the work we've done with the business community to ensure that we have been advocating together the importance of frequent, reliable services and not cutting tube and bus services at this point in time. And there's been a coalition of business groups, organisations such as London First, John Dickey, Richard Burge at the London Chamber of Commerce and Industry, have been really powerful advocates that have worked with me and TfL, you know, to actually make the case for why that government investment is so critical. Pre-COVID, I mean, a very different example would be some of the work that I've done to keep alive the development work on a project which is the extension of the DLR out to Thamesmead, building a new station at Beckton as well. And for that I had to bring together developers, the local authorities, Greenwich and Newham in that case, and I was able to secure a financial contribution from a series of developers such as Peabody, Lendlease, Aberdeen Investments, Newham and Greenwich, to put with some money that TfL had set aside to ensure that that project could continue to be developed, and, you know, thinking outside of the box about how we can ensure that these schemes are still being worked on, I think is really important, because whilst times are really difficult at the moment, if we're going to meet our housing targets in future, if people need to live in areas that are connected to the public transport network, and so I think that would be probably an example I'd give you.
Okay, thank you. And then also, just particularly in light of the fact that we've had this new funding settlement, which is welcome, but it is very short term in its nature and doesn't necessarily allow for long-term planning. How have you worked with the government to ensure that you can deliver on the Mayor's transport commitments, and just a little bit of that looking forward within that context?
So I have a good relationship with junior ministers in DFT, people like Charlotte Veer, Chris Heaton-Harris. I have an honest relationship with the Secretary of State. You know, we do meet quite regularly. I'm part of the Hammersmith Bridge Task Force, for example, where we're trying to find a solution to how we can get that bridge reopened as soon as possible. That happens on a sort of fortnightly basis, generally speaking. And, you know, I think I will, you know, I think I may have missed one of those meetings over the course of the last year. So I think making myself available to be part of, you know, grown-up, mature conversations with government is the right way to go. As a result of the funding deal that has been concluded very recently, there are a series of pieces of work that need to be done, some of which require City Hall representation. And so whether it's actually me that is part of the working group, or, you know, members of my brilliant transport team here, I would be very closely involved with any work that was going on there through those forums. And so it happens in different places, but you know, I think we have a good ongoing dialogue at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a few questions now myself, but if you could, they're all ones that can be answered quite quickly, if you would. You've mentioned to two of the Assembly members about building basically on station car parks. Do you think that's the way forward to get rid of station car parks or minimise them?
Yes, I do. I think I think we can retain some car parking in those developments. Often outer London train stations, the people that are driving in are often driving in from outside of London, causing congestion on the roads. And I think the best way of achieving our housing targets, there's a desperate need for new homes in London, definitely affordable housing. And I think that building that right next to stations will reduce people's reliance upon using cars.
Do you not think it might have an impact on businesses, because people need to get into London to work and spend their money? Do you not think by this policy it will have a knock-on effect on the recovery of London?
So there's some quite interesting research about high streets and how much people spend when they travel to the high streets by different modes of transport. And actually, if you walk and cycle to shops, some research that I've seen shows that over the course of a month, you tend to spend 40% more than people that are travelling by car. And so, you know, I think that if you create communities, mixed communities, high quality design, right next to some of our tube stations where we have got land, I think that is, I think it's right that that's what we're looking at doing.
Okay. Earlier you said you regret not pushing Crossrail harder. Are you now pushing them a great deal harder?
I think what I said was I regret not pushing them harder to have taken more time to establish what the delivery schedule is likely to be at the point at which the new management team was put in place in 2019. I can assure you that I have very regular discussions and very robust discussions with both the Managing Director of Crossrail, Mark Wilde, and with Andy Byford, the Commissioner, who has taken a more active role in recent months with regard to the delivery of Crossrail. And so that's what I was referring to.
And there's now a proper time schedule for that, is there?
The anticipated opening window is the first 6 months of next year.
Next year?
Correct, yeah. And that was the date that we announced in August of last year, the previous Crossrail board
I think
announced.
some of us are pretty shocked by all of that. At your previous confirmation hearing, you told the committee, and I'm quoting you, I believe there is a way forward that can be found for Crossrail 2. Do you still believe that?
We, as a condition of the government funding deal in October of last year, we were required to cease further development work on it and to bring the work that has been done to a sensible close, so that if at some point in the future when funding allows it could be picked up again, that the work is all neatly packaged up and can be taken off the shelf. I do still want to work with government to progress some updated safeguarding directions for Crossrail 2. That would be the next step that needs to be done, but we are responding to a government request, and at the moment the funding is not available.
I was going through your last confirmation hearing, so if you don't mind, I'm going to refer to a couple of things. Do you think you've done enough over the last 3 years, particularly in terms of improving public transport provision in outer London, to be on track to meet the Mayor's target of, to quote you from your 2018 confirmation hearing, moving to a situation in 2040 where 80% of trips are done either using public transport, by walking or by cycling?
I think there's more to do in outer London, but I am pleased that in the course of the last 5 years we have been able to introduce new bus routes in outer London. I think it's 9 bus routes. We've made extensions to bus routes, a further 9. We've increased frequency on over 100 bus routes in outer London. Some of the big infrastructure projects that would really be a game changer in terms of mode share and the number of people using public transport, whether that's something like the West London Orbital, the Sutton Tram Link, Crossrail 2, Bakerloo Line extension, those require very significant amounts of money, hundreds of millions of pounds, if not billions of pounds, in the case of things such as the Bakerloo Line extension and Crossrail 2. And so I think where we have been able to make modifications to the transport network to improve the offer, for example on buses to people in outer London, then we've done what we can, but we have to be cognizant of the very difficult funding situation that exists.
Well, the funding has always been issues, I assume, on these very large ticket items. So going back to the question, you said should be moving to a situation in 2040 where 80% of trips are done by using public transport, walking or cycling. So what percentage are you estimating now by 2040?
So that's still our aspiration. As I said earlier in the hearing, the COVID pandemic has set us back in terms of our sustainable mode share. Pre-COVID, we were at 63%. I've always said that there wouldn't be a linear trajectory towards reaching 80%. When big new infrastructure projects come on stream, you would see you would imagine that you would see quite a significant uplift in public transport usage. So when Crossrail is running from Reading to Shenfield, going through the tunnel in central London, I would imagine the point at which that happens, you will see more people using public transport because of how convenient it is. So we don't have at the moment, I haven't updated the target. I think it's right still to aim to have 80% of journeys done by walking, cycling, public transport.
Equally, it's nice to have figures that we can actually look at. We can all aspire to different things, but it's nice to know what we think might be the reality.
There's a lot of information in the Travel in London report that I think is being published
I look
tomorrow
forward to that being updated
by the TfL board.
If you could keep this brief, what would you say has been your biggest single mistake or misjudgment during the previous 3 years?
I think I've already talked about it, and you've quizzed me on it in relation to not asking Crossrail to take
So it's the
longer. You are seeking, with respect, Chair, you are seeking to summarise my responses for me. What I've said about Crossrail is that I regret not asking the management team to take longer, to take more time to determine what realistic and achievable delivery schedule would be.
So that
so I've
is
set
your...
that out. I think you're simply trying to characterise it as just being that, you know, I regret actions generally that I've taken with Crossrail, and that's not the case, and that would be an unfair and an untrue representation is what I'm saying.
It's just good to be self-aware, Deputy Mayor, and we're just
well, I think I've
asking questions
I think
to
I've
see. I mean,
demonstrated.
all of us can say that
I've
we've made
demonstrated my
mistakes at various times, and it's interesting for others to see what we regard as a mistake that we've made. At your previous confirmation hearing, Assemblymember Russell asked you about TfL and the Mayor's relationship with the boroughs, and you replied there is a solid relationship there. Do you think that this belief was correct and is still the case?
I think with the majority of London boroughs, yes, and I think I have worked hard to improve on that.
Okay. At your previous confirmation hearing, you told the committee, and I'm quoting, I believe there is a way forward that can be found on Crossrail. Oh, I've done that, forgive me. I've done that one. In 2018, you told Assemblymember Pigeon that you would look at whether bus contracts should have safety incentives built into them, given the Vision Zero target of eliminating bus deaths by 2030. I don't think that's been done.
We have made some progress with the bus safety standard, and I'd be happy to write to you with more information on that.
Okay, and I think this is the last one. In his manifesto, Steve Khan, who scrapped proactive road maintenance for 3 of his 5 years as mayor, claimed decades of underfunding for London's roads maintenance means that repairs to ageing infrastructure becomes very challenging. Do you agree that London's road maintenance has been underfunded for decades, and will you guarantee that this mayor will not be part of that problem over the next 3 years?
All that I can guarantee is that we will operate within the constraints that the government is setting for us, and I can tell you that as a result of the funding deal that has been agreed overnight, that actually there are going to be significant pressures on things such as the road maintenance programme. Had the government given us the money that we'd asked for, the money that we set out in our budget, then that we would have been able to actually, move forward with some, a more significant programme of road maintenance and repairs. I think that's going to be challenging in the circumstances that this funding settlement has provided to us.
Okay, Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered, because you did refer to it in passing in your remarks, but what difference would it have made to have kept that £700 million operating grant that we no longer get, that was handed back by the previous mayor? How much difference would that have made to road maintenance, both in the past, in the last couple of years since you became the Deputy Mayor, since 2018, and also going forward over the next 3 years? I mean, by my estimation, 700 million times 3 for the roads of London is quite a lot of money, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it would be. You're right about that. And what we had to do during the previous administration was to focus our efforts on safety critical work as opposed to a proactive rolling programme of upgrades. And so that level of funding would make a big difference to the amount of money that could be put into roads maintenance.
Yes, I thought you might say that. I mean, I think it's very disappointing, really, that it was given back. What about vehicle excise duty? Because obviously Londoners pay in through car tax, as most people call it, an estimated 500 million a year.
That's
all
right.
goes into central coffers. But unlike every other part of the country, we don't get any of it back. We're getting any part of that, if not the whole of it back. But how much of a difference would that make to, Transport for London as a whole over the next 3 years?
It would make a huge difference, and it just doesn't seem fair that people in London pay £500 million worth of vehicle excise duty every year, and that money is spent almost exclusively on roads outside London, and so it would make a huge, very significant difference. It would also potentially free up some of our the business rates that go from the mayor to TfL. You could use the business rates to invest in other things, positive schemes that would improve the public transport network, extend it. You could electrify London's buses at a faster rate. There's a huge number of things that you could do with additional money of that quantum.
Do you think it's fair to argue, as some people do, because we get no operating grant anymore, the 700 million is gone, and because we don't get any of that £500 million back from vehicle excise duty from people who drive, that people who use public transport are effectively paying for the upkeep of roads that perhaps they're not even driving on because they don't even own vehicles? Do you think it's fair to argue that?
I have said that previously myself. I do feel that there is an effective subsidy from public transport users to people who are using the roads. Pre-pandemic, the only part of TfL to, in effect, make a profit that then could be reinvested in other things was the tube network. And so we subsidise the buses, rightly so, in my view, for an integrated public transport authority. But I do think effectively we are in a situation where public transport users are subsidising road users.
So in fact you could argue that the more successful you are at healthy streets and healthy people, the worse the position is overall financially for Transport for London.
You could argue that. I have always taken the view that we have to do what is right for the good of the city and the health of the city. And I think if we get more people walking and cycling more of their journeys, ideally I want those people who are in cars making short journeys. We know there's a huge number of short journeys that are done in cars in London. They need to be switched where it's possible. Sometimes it won't be possible, and I understand that. But if all of us could actually walk and cycle those short journeys, I think that would be positive for the city. And I think if we can, even if we take people off of public transport and they are walking and cycling, I think that is good for the health of the city, actually. And I think that at that point, TfL, goes back to Assemblymember Berry's question about the resilience of the funding model.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to get a bit more of a feel for the Deputy Mayor's how we're going to be taking forward the key responsibilities and issues for Transport for London for the future. That was really helpful. Thank you.
I'm sure everybody in this chamber is happy for London to have more money, and I know various members criticise the government. Can you just remind all of us how much the government has given to TfL in the last, if you add it all up, how many billions has the government given TfL for the bailouts?
So in May of last year, it was a grant of 1.1 billion, and they asked TfL to borrow additionally. So they asked TfL to borrow 500 million. In October of last year, the settlement was, I think it was 900 million, but with a top-up mechanism. And so the overall amount that we've received is greater. I think overall we received 1.7 billion in the October funding deal. And then you will have seen the announcement this morning about the period from today through to the 11th of December this year, which provides for 1.08 billion pounds worth of funding, again with the potential top-up mechanism.
Okay, so quite a few billion to help TfL out. Okay, are there any other questions? No.
Can I ask some questions?
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Thank you, Chair. Heidi, of course, you've referred to this a number of times in your evidence to the hearing, but the funding is a big challenge for us, and that remains a big challenge because we failed to get a long-term sustainable funding arrangement with the government. The government has given some grant rather than a bailout. It should be considered as a grant because London did the right thing during COVID-19. Given the change, and I think one of the requirements is that we have to reduce our costs, our savings by £900 million, something of that nature. How are we going to achieve that, and what's going to be the impact of this on Londoners?
We're going to have to work through all the detail of that, and TfL will be publishing a revised budget in July. One of the things that the Mayor did fight very hard on, and TfL fought very hard on, was the government wanted to make an element of the savings, hundreds of millions of pounds worth of recurring savings, so year in, year out, starting this year. And we were able to convince government that that wasn't the right thing to do. We pointed out to them that actually if you asked TfL to make £300 million worth of recurring savings starting this year, it would be equivalent to withdrawing 1 in 5 of London's bus routes. And we said that is not, that's not the right thing to be doing at the moment. I'm pleased that we were able to persuade government of that, but the overall level of savings that this settlement requires is going to need the deferral of some capital projects. We'll be setting all of that out in due course when we publish the revised budget, probably at the end of this month, beginning of next month.
Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to that revised budget with my budget hat on. Okay, any other questions? No. Can I thank Heidi Alexander for attending today's meeting and for her helpful contributions. You may now leave, Heidi, if you want to. You can sit and listen to us talking about you if you want to. It's completely up to you.
I may leave because I've got quite a busy day, to
Yeah,
be honest,
no,
so I'll let you carry on with your
I don't blame
discussions.
you.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's wait until Heidi's gone and then we can discuss the rest of this. Thank you for coming, Heidi. You can stay while we talk about you.
I think that'd be a bit weird.
Okay, now, either agree as is that Heidi Alexander remains Deputy Chair, or we can amend what we go through to approve. I mean, I think she answered our questions well today. There are some issues with the answers, but I think we can pick those up in committee. I don't know what my colleagues think.
I think we should just confirm her as it is.
Of course you do, Wonka.
No, but the reason I think this, Chair, is based on the evidence of this morning's hearing.
Is there anything anybody would like to put in as a caveat that we'd like to see going forward? Sian?
I was a little disappointed by the question of, what's your vision? What's your plan? Why are you doing this job? But she is the Mayor's choice. This reflects the Mayor's attitude and policies to some extent. So I don't think there's anything we can do about that, the sort of political gaps there are in there. I was quite impressed with some of the answers to, you know, what have you learned? Because there's obviously been a lot to learn this term.
Of course.
And there's something clear there from her, so I'm quite happy.
Okay. Everybody else happy? Okay, fine. Right, I think I can go straight to the end now. Thank you. So, well, thank you all of you. A letter will be sent to the Mayor following this meeting to confirm the committee's recommendation, and that is that we approve and are happy for Heidi to remain as Deputy Mayor for Transport. Okay? So that then ends the meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.